Good morning and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, depending on where you are in our world today. On behalf of the GECKO Consortium, I would like to welcome you to the second day of this final conference. I'll introduce myself again. My name is Yannick Busse from UITP, which is the International Association of Public Transport. I'm also the coordinator of this project. And after 33 months, this GECKO project is coming to an end. With this final conference, we would like to also present to you an overview of the results from this project. So we have our agenda for today. If you joined us yesterday, then you would have already seen that we had an introduction to the project and an introduction also to the wider context of what is surrounding the GECKO project, the sort of conditions around the project, an overview of the methodology of the project itself, and a brief introduction to the results, which we'll go into more details on today. Then our partners was presenting yesterday also results about business models, technologies, services, and trends going on related to new mobility solutions, and also what were the regulatory responses that we found coming from how the regulatory market responded then to these innovations. And then we closed yesterday with a question and answer session. For today, we will go more into the our regulatory supportive tool, which we have developed in the project. And then we'll also have a presentation about the recommendations that we have formulated for policymakers. And we'll also have a presentation about how does disruptive mobility innovations, how does regulation, how does this fit within the sustainable urban mobility planning framework which has been established. Again, as yesterday, we'll have a time for questions and answer at the end of this session. So feel free to already put any questions you would have during the presentations. You can write this in the chat box of this Microsoft Teams. And if you would like to even open up your microphone, then write that also in the chat box, and we can then enable that also. We can allow this and open this up for you. So without further ado, then I think we can move on to our first speaker for today. So I will hand over to Marissa. Marissa holds a master's degree in transport infrastructure engineering from the University of Roma Tre. She has been working at Fit Consulting since 2019 as a junior project manager, and she's also secretary of the Young Freight Leaders Council since June 2020. So Marissa, I will hand over to yourself for our first presentation of today then.
Thank you, Yannick. Let me share my screen. Can you see it?
Yes, we can see your screen and we can see you.
Okay, thank you. In GECKO, Fit Consulting worked on the assessment of regulatory frameworks in terms of their capability in enabling the introduction or deployment of these new mobility solutions we are studying in GECKO. And the results of this assessment have been displayed in the compliance map, which is a tool we developed to show the results of this assessment, and that could help policymakers in identifying and anticipating factors that may hinder this adoption or deployment. By also looking at other countries or cities that already implemented them. So here is a list of things we will see. So first of all, we will explain better the objective addressed by the tool. Then we will briefly see the methodological approach we follow to perform this assessment, and finally we will see the tool directly from the GECKO website where it is already available. So let's see at the objective addressed on the tool. In GECKO, we performed the assessment of the capability of regulatory frameworks in enabling the implementation of these innovative technologies and business models in the mobility field. While at the same time, of course, safeguarding adequate level of security, safety, data privacy, and social protection. And the results of this assessment have been reported on the compliance map. So now let's see how we performed this assessment. So let's see at the methodological approach we followed. First of all, I think it's important to clarify what we mean by regulatory frameworks in GECKO. We could say that in GECKO, by regulatory frameworks, we mean that set of binding and non-binding rules, but also initiatives and investments related to each city or regions or country, componing the regulatory environment that the introduction or deployment of a new mobility solution has to deal with. So now that we clarified what we mean by regulatory frameworks, let's see how we performed this assessment. The first thing we did is to identify 10 evaluation categories. These evaluation categories represent the main themes under which this assessment have been performed. Then, within each evaluation category, we identified a set of indicators to be selected according to their relevance with each mobility solution we are assessing. And to quantify these indicators, we relied both on the help of the GECKO stakeholders. So thank you to the GECKO stakeholders who helped us in this exercise. And so they first of all, they identified the key aspects to be regulated for the adoption or deployment of these mobility solutions, and assessed the effectiveness of the regulatory frameworks, starting from reading some relevant excerpts of the main regulatory texts. But then we also relied on existing indicators available in existing international databases such as OECD.stat, World Economic Forum, International Chamber of Commerce, etc. For example, World Economic Forum includes indicators such as the legal framework's adaptability to digital business model, which are indicators that go beyond the mobility scope, but that of course affect the capability of a city or a country to accommodate the introduction of these mobility solutions. So we could say that this approach allowed us to assess not only the specific regulation dealing with the introduction of a mobility solution, but the overall environment in which this specific regulation fit. So the next step was then to understand the import within each evaluation category, the importance to be assigned to each indicator. So regarding the evaluation category data, and if we are talking about connected automated vehicles, is it more important the data management aspect or the cybersecurity aspect? And is it the same if we are, for example, talking about mobility as a service? Of course not. So we carried out a round of interviews with GECKO stakeholders to understand what weight assigned to each indicator within each evaluation category. And by doing this exercise for all of the 10 evaluation categories, we have been able to come up with an overall synthetic index, which is the regulation compliance, which is an index meaningful to represent the level of effectiveness of regulatory frameworks in enabling these mobility solutions. Now let's see at the compliance map. First of all, the database feeding the compliance map, as said by Yannick yesterday. We analyzed more than 220 regulations covering macro-geographical areas from all of the world. And covering the mobility solutions represented here in the graphs. We can say that the compliance map is a regulatory and supportive tool for a practical synthesis of regulatory schemes, showing the similarities and differences of different regulatory schemes among cities or countries in the world that share the common goal of enabling these new mobility innovations. The compliance map provides three main indexes, three main functionalities. The first one is the regulation compliance. I already explained it. This index is meaningful to represent the effectiveness of regulatory frameworks in regulating the different aspects needed to a sustainable adoption of these mobility solutions. And then we have the regulation readiness, which is an index derived from the previous one, representing the readiness level of the regulatory frameworks related to each country to accommodate the introduction of different combination of penetration of each mobility solution. And finally, we performed also an overview of the main barriers affecting the adoption of these mobility solutions. So now let's see the compliance map directly from the website. Okay, so you can, this is the GECKO website, and you can go to the compliance map webpage by clicking here, tool, and then compliance map. And here you will see the three boxes. The first two are for the regulation compliance, one representing the country level and the other one representing the city level. Here you will see the countries colored with a darker color, representing the higher level of compliance, higher value of the index, which means that the darker color means that the regulatory frameworks related to the country is more effective in regulating the adoption or deployment of the mobility solutions that you can select here. And then you can, by hovering your mouse on each country, you will see also some information such as the name of the country, of course, the score obtained from the assessment, a brief description of the regulatory approach adopted in that country, the name of the main regulatory text consulted to perform the assessment, and then by clicking here, you can also be redirected to the regulatory text or the document consulted to perform this assessment. Then, as I said, you can choose to see the overall index or also one of its components. So if I'm more interested on the social aspect, I can select here, and you will see the colors updating automatically, representing the partial score obtained for the social aspect. So here you will see the score obtained for the social aspect. You can also see the city level. The information are practically the same, but here you can see the solutions, mobility solutions more related to local level. And finally, here you have the regulatory readiness level. Here you can select the combination of penetration levels for each mobility solution, and you will see the colors automatically updating. Again, darker colors means that that country is more ready to accommodate this combination of penetrations of these mobility solutions. And again, you can choose to see the overall index or one of its components. Then here you can consult some guidelines for the compliance map. That will help you in navigate through the contents provided by the compliance map and also interpret the indexes. And finally, here you have the barriers, which and here we performed an overall overview of the main barriers affecting the adoption or deployment of the mobility solutions that you have here. So here you can select again the mobility solution to be displayed, and you will see the collection of the barriers affecting the adoption of big data for transport mobility, colored according to the category of barriers. Then you can also select the barrier, and you will see a description of the barrier, and by hovering your mouse you will also see the solutions that can help to overcome the barrier, and if available also best practice. So that's all for the compliance map. And one last thing is that by showing the compliance map, we registered that the name compliance map is not that intuitive. So we are trying to come up with with new names for the tool. So I kindly ask Arthur or somebody to share the pool we are doing to choose a new name for the tool. That's all from my side. If you have any question, please write it down on the chat, and I will glad to answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marissa. We have the poll open now in the chat box. So feel free to go to the chat of Microsoft Teams. I already see some answers coming in. We'll give it a bit of more time so that we can collect some more answers. I see they're still coming in. So let's give it another moment. We're up to 12 responses now. So feel free to answer to what you think the tool should be called. I'll just go over the options basically. So the first one is MOBI, map of regulatory framework for the mobility of the future. The second option, regulatory map for future mobility. The third one, mobility regulations monitoring map, or ERMS, evaluation of regulations for mobility emerging solutions. Okay, so we're up to 20 responses now. Let's see if we can get maybe just one or two more, and then we can close this poll. So far, I see that the first option is in the lead. So I think we can close it here. We have the responses. So 10 responses, or 50% now. Half of the participants think that MOBI should be the name. Map of regulatory frameworks for the mobility of the future, Marisa.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Thanks everyone for taking part. And thanks a lot, Marisa. Okay, so then we can go on to our next presentation. So I will be speaking about the recommendations for policymakers that we have been formulating in the project itself. So we have been doing some work related to what are the key conclusions, the key messages, recommendations, and we can share some of these results for you here today as the first time we're presenting this. So the aim was really to, we wanted to formulate recommendations to devise new regulatory schemes, frameworks, and governance models. And this could provide key priorities towards adaptive new regulation frameworks for future mobility. And we also wanted to look at a future horizon towards 2040, and also both for passenger and also for freight transport. And this would then also enable adaptive and anticipatory regulatory schemes and governance with novel policies that contribute to wider sustainable mobility goals. And these recommendations have been processed and been formulated really towards the European institutions, but also for public authorities also. That's the target audience of the recommendations. So how did we go about to do this? We set out several steps in the process. First, we made a review of all of the project deliverables in GECKO by the consortium. We made an analysis of this, took out the key recommendations that we thought would be useful, and then we engaged with our stakeholders. Again, as said yesterday, we had a database of over 180 stakeholders which we were working with in this project, and we conducted then a survey with the stakeholders to select the most strongly agreed recommendations. And then we held a workshop, again with the stakeholders, and we had several rounds of group work and discussion questions where we were able to process and discuss these recommendations. Today here we're presenting these at the final conference, and then in the next step we'll be publishing these results on the GECKO website also. So you'll be able to go through these and find all the recommendations. This is an overview of some of the key recommendations that we have formulated with the different categories also. So we're speaking about new regulatory and governance approaches, about business models and new mobility services, cooperation of public and private parties within the various services, data and sustainability, as these were also two key aspects of the project which we found in our discussions. So some of the recommendations, what we also found is then that an encouragement basically to establish a common framework for governing mobility innovations. And this could take place by listing various instruments that are most appropriate for governing new interventions, for governing interventions of new mobility solutions, in view of their specific conditions of this mobility innovation. And so this could take place in addition to the more traditional methods, such as binding rules or market approaches, but then we could then have these new flexible and adaptive governance approaches, which we have been discussing and researching in this project, such as collaborative governance, outcome-based regulation, and regulatory sandboxes could be included in this, this framework, basically. And the appropriateness of this governance approach would then also depend on the domain where it's applied and the specific conditions of where it's been applied. The next point that we could provide cross-sectoral guidance and facilitate communication across governance levels and industry sectors. So we have seen also a blurring of industry boundaries, but nonetheless, there are still regulatory silos which still exist. And often then also the competencies for regulating across these different sectors can be found in different stakeholders across different organizations, which complicates also the regulatory process. So forums, places to meet, platforms could be then formed to facilitate communication across governance levels and industry sectors. Something for public authorities, then they could also encourage the development of flexible regulation and policies, also with this new mobility platform, so specifically for new mobility platforms, forums, where knowledge and technology resources can be exchanged. So as new mobility services also combine resources from various different sectors and industries to address the needs of customers, then an adaptive governance framework would also support and help formulation of new business models and innovation in business models. So local governments, public authorities would be able to support the development and of these new business models by setting up these platforms where new operators, firms, institutions, entrepreneurs can connect and exchange, and also put together resources to enable them to come up and innovate their business models. And this would especially benefit new mobility operators and new mobility solutions. The next recommendation is that the EU could identify and drive consultation around common needs between public and private parties. So here also for new mobility services to succeed, a strong cooperation between these two parties is essential. Also, and public authorities could take a proactive approach to the governance of these disruptive mobility solutions by including private and public parties in dialogue with each other and developing these innovations, and also help steer them in the path that would aim to meet the policy goals of the authorities. And this could take place also by these collaboration mechanisms, which could include national level, local levels, regional level, different regulatory levels to help support the process. In terms of data, this was also a point that was discussed. And here we could encourage the European Union to set up requirements, a minimum set of requirements for the management of data for mobility services. As what we see also is that there are still challenges, several challenges, such as legal ambiguities of the data ownership, privacy, data protection, and this can limit and restrict the data and analytics which has become available or shared in a sustainable way in the transport sector. So by a set of guidance for data management. This could develop and help resolve some of these issues, legal ambiguities, and also provide additional certainty related to data. And this could provide then a kind of soft approach for better data governance. So it would not have to be a very rigid approach. And this will also especially benefit new mobility operators and new mobility providers. Another recommendation related to sustainability is that the EU could encourage or standardize or define procedures and forms, contracts for the agreement between cities and new mobility providers. And this could then support the implementation of the services, as we see that these regulations that are provided should consider the environmental sustainability in the services, and how this could benefit communities and urban areas and citizens in a maximum way. And these positive impacts that are coming from the new mobility service, the strategies on how they will pursue sustainability goals which have been set out by the city, the monitoring of these strategies, the measures if the service does not reach certain expected targets. This could be clearly formulated in the requirements to operate, or in the contract agreements between the authority and the new mobility provider. And this would also then provide support in the how to towards a deep decarbonization of urban mobility. So these is an overview of our recommendations which we have formulated. This has been throughout the consortium, so you see there a list of partners which have contributed to this, and this will also be published on the websites that we have, and look forward to any responses or comments that you would have on these recommendations. So thank you very much for that. Again, we're encouraging, if you have questions or comments, please put these in the chat and we will be able to come to these at the end of the session. So now we will go on to our next presentation. And for that, I would call Marlene to as a speaker.
Hello, everyone. Hello, Yannick.
Hello. So Marlene Damero is a geographer and works since 2018 for Ruprecht Consult as a project manager, and is also an expert for sustainable urban mobility planning, logistics, and energy topics. And in her former professional roles, this included research at the Institute for Regional and Urban Development in Dortmund, consultancy work also in the field of energy transition and mobility, and also working as an urban planner for the municipality of Kassel. So yes. Marlene, I'll hand over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Yannick. I am now sharing my screen, putting it on full screen. Second. So, as Yannick said, my name is Marlene Damrau. I work for Ruprecht Consult, and Ruprecht Consult is a partner of the GECKO project. And my presentation has the title, How Can Local Authorities Address Regulation of New Mobilities within their SUMP? And building on, not intentionally, but logically, the presentation of Yannick, who concluded with recommendations also how cities could deal with new mobilities. I continue right away with this topic. So SUMP is a concept, it's actually an abbreviation for sustainable urban mobility planning, and it is a concept for integrated mobility planning that is building on the 8 universal SUMP principles that you see on my slide. And we at Ruprecht Consult, we were wrapping our head around the question what public authorities can actually do with the results from the GECKO project when they want to develop regulatory measures within their sustainable urban mobility plans. So why should they want to do this? Of course, there's some potential coming from these disruptive mobility innovations that could actually increase the quality of life in cities and reduce emissions from the transport system. But we all know that public, especially local authorities, face challenges when they want to address these disruptive innovations in their SCMP, because they are defining the local policies, but of course are dependent on regulations coming from the European and national level. They want to avoid certain risks that come along with implementing these innovations, but however, want flexibility and development for these innovations so that they can continue their development process. This means that local authorities need good practice, seeing how other local authorities and cities are dealing with the situation. And this is why my colleagues and me have been putting together results from the GECKO project around the 8 SCMP principles. I will show you this very quickly in a moment, but of course I can only be very quick and short. So you will find our report shortly on the GECKO website, where you can find more information. So the first SUMP principle is planning for sustainable mobility and a functional urban area. What does this mean? It means that we don't want to stop at administrative boundaries when we plan for sustainable urban mobility, but we want to follow the traffic flows in the daily urban system, which means that we are looking as a planning base on the functional area of the cities that go beyond administrative borders. So in order to develop coherent regulations for new mobilities, we need to work together with stakeholders from, for example, neighboring communities in order to come to, all these questions, set standards for interoperability to tackle legal barriers. Also, have common regulations that tackle privacy, security problems, and so on. So how can this be done? We know that local authorities are limited here because they really depend on regulations from the national and international level, but what they can do is they can test at the local level to gain insights based on data and to develop together with stakeholders from other institutional levels, from the national and international level, and also within their functional city, involve all local stakeholders from the functional area to together develop and test regulations. One example is the testing of last mile delivery drones by the city of Hamburg, where the city included stakeholders from neighboring municipalities, but also a lot of other stakeholders, also from superior levels, developing and testing the regulation. And they say that cities and regions should have a decisive role in developing regulations. Coming to my next slide, the next principle is cooperation across institutional boundaries. And by this principle, it is meant that when you develop a regulation, you should, of course, cooperate with different departments within your local authority, but of course, also, as I said, go beyond administrative boundaries. That means go for horizontal cooperation, but also for vertical cooperation by talking to stakeholders from superior governance level. But it also means intersectoral cooperation, which means involving stakeholders from the private and the civic sector when developing regulatory measures. This can be interesting or important when you want to develop regulations for example, how to share data or how to tackle the topic of cybersecurity in order to define norms and standards. And you want to find a balance and not to overregulate these new mobilities. How can this be done? So the city of Bremen cooperates with scooter operators on the topic of data exchange. This is an example for the so-called collaborative regulation, a governance model that was presented previously also here in the final conference. And it means to work together with private stakeholders from the private sector to collectively define joint rules, for example, for the topic of data integration. Involving citizens and stakeholders is the next universal principle. And this is important in terms of regulation development because you want to make sure that user needs and also public concerns are met by those regulations. You also want to avoid, for example, unwanted effects of regulations, such as, for example, discriminatory data application. And an example is for how to involve citizens and stakeholders would be the testing of the national regulation for autonomous vehicles in France that took place in 2019, where the regulation was tested together with public transport and personal vehicle operators, and also on freight and logistic vehicles. And this is a framework or a regulatory governance model that is called regulatory sandboxing, where you test a solution in a restricted area in order to provide data to assess the possible impacts of this regulation, also in terms of are end user needs met. Assessing the current and future performance of a regulation is crucial in order to gather enough data so that you know if the regulation makes sense or not. If you want to achieve a specific outcome, you can assess if you are actually reaching it, and it also enables you to make predictions. So it's important to define indicators and to measure the performance and the impact when you test a regulation. And an example here would be the Declaration of Amsterdam on connected and automated driving, where the European Commission and the private sector and member states together agreed on joint goals and joint actions, how to facilitate the introduction of connected and automated vehicles, but they did not identify how this should be reached. So you base the regulation on the outcome and not on the process, which explains the name outcome-based regulation. And defining a long-term vision and a clear implementation plan is also extremely crucial when developing a regulatory measure within a SCMP. Why is that? Because cities need to know what they want or what they don't want in order to be able to define regulatory measures that really fit to the overall objectives that a city has. And it also enables the private sector to come up with targeted solutions that fit to the local policy objectives. And how can this be done? Actually, you need as a local public authority to have a clear policy and a vision in place and translate it into clear objectives, quantified targets, and clear measures. An example for this would be the city of Graz that did not allow e-scooters because they had decided to focus on their investment program on cycling. coming to the next principle, it is to develop our transport modes in an integrated manner in terms of regulation. This is also very important because the different transport modes are still quite fragmented also in terms of regulation. So in order to transition to more sustainable modes and to improve the connectivity of the infrastructures, yeah, this is crucial. So how can this be done? You test and evaluate impacts to make better predictions. And you do this before you become too specific and too detailed when defining the classifications for the regulation. And you also want to avoid contradictions, such as don't, test a transport and demand service to a place where you also plan a parking lot. So that would be contradictory. And this is something that you avoid when you have an integrated planning procedure, such as the SUMP. An example for developing transport modes in an integrated manner by regulation would be the Finnish Act on Transport Services that regulates digitalization in public transport in terms of, for example, interoperability and data and information systems. It combines all transport modes and, for example, sets objectives for the transport sector and also for related digital services. And this was a good starting point for the city of Helsinki to introduce the Mobility as a Service app in Helsinki. Arranging for monitoring and evaluation is important because you want to actually monitor the progress towards your objective. And you also want to increase the effectiveness of regulation or adapt them if they don't meet the objectives. How can this be done? It's crucial to analyze impacts of regulations by monitoring performance based on certain indicators. Risk-weighted regulation is a governance model that was applied by the National Rail Safety Regulator in Australia that employed this process to improve rail safety. And you do it as follows. You have a certain list of risks and the suitable mitigation measures and a certain prioritization also on that list. So you test the regulation and you collect evidence and you just take the mitigation measures when one of the risks on the list are ticked. Assuring quality of the whole process is also crucial. How can you do that? You need a high quality of data and you have to define criteria for governance and regulation. Risk management is also important along the process, but as long as you consider the other 7 SUMP principles when you develop regulatory measures as part of your SUMP, you're on the good side. And as a conclusion, yes, local authorities can develop regulatory measures for new mobilities as part of the SUMP, and they can boost innovation with this. They can follow, new flexible governance models as suggested by the GECKO project, but they do need support from superior levels in, defining regulatory action. You find more information on SUMP following the link that I added to the slide. And thank you for listening. So this was my presentation.
Thank you very much, Marlene. Okay, so now that concludes for today our presentations. Now we can move to the question and answer segment. So I'll ask our moderator, Caroline, and also Marisa to join us. In the meantime, I'll introduce our moderator. So Caroline has a PhD from the University of Bordeaux in atom optics. Her passion for subjects such as new technologies inspired Caroline to join Upsiski as an innovation consultant in 2018. And since then, she has been studying new business models and regulatory frameworks, and in particular related to intelligent transport systems and disruptive mobility innovations.
Yes, so thank you, Yannick. Hello, everybody. So thanks for the first question. So we will start with the first question from VIT77. So what are the collaboration mechanisms mentioned by Yannick?
Okay, I can say some words about this. So we looked into various collaboration mechanisms, models of collaboration in the project, and this could either have been a kind of a contract which would be established between the authority and the new mobility operator, which provides, however, though a bit more of a rigid framework, and that is the traditional setting between the two parties. However, if you would like to go for something a bit more flexible, a bit more adaptive, and somehow for the new mobility operator to also have some room for maneuver, then you could opt for a memorandum of understanding. And we have seen this also in various examples. One of them highlighted already in the previous presentation was in Lisbon, for example, for new mobility and sharing services. So that could be one option there. Or there could be collaboration which takes place informally between the two parties. Or in some cases, we have seen that there's even no collaboration at all, where there's no sharing of information, no data sharing taking place. So those are the four different models that we have looked into the project.
Okay, thank you, Yannick. So I think that the second question is for all of you. What about public financing? Is it possible, on your opinion, to shift from the present sectorial financing of public transport to a new integrated financing of sustainable mobility? So, in other words, the subsidies to the users instead of to the operators.
Maybe I can say start with that. One thing, I mean, some practices that we have seen, for example, is to offer mobility budgets to persons, employees, stakeholders, where they can then choose their own way how to spend their mobility budget through either a combination of public transport, sharing schemes, new mobility services. So that could be one way. And in the project, we have also looked into one case in North America where there was direct subsidy to users, where there was this was a kind of a small, relatively small urban area, which did not have enough coverage of their public transport network, and their citizens were able to request and receive subsidy to then use a ride-hailing service instead of to complement also with the public transport. And so this could also be options where the public transport network is not substantially enough developed, where citizens are then receiving a subsidy to use new mobility solutions so that they can complement the various services existing in their local area.
Okay, thank you. Marisa, Marlene, do you have other thoughts on this point?
I will add that I think that the important thing is also to, from the public authority and policymakers' point of view, is also important to include in this funding scheme mobility solutions that are in some way sustainable and that can be proved to be sustainable, to include them in this credit scheme towards the end user instead of the directly financing the mobility transport provider. So I would like to highlight the importance the importance of monitoring the indicators of sustainability related to each mobility service provided, also from the private sector.
So you mean that it's rather important to test a service, assess its sustainability before subsidies, before giving subsidies to them?
Yes, both in terms of direct funding, but also in including these private services in rewarding scheme or credit scheme for the end user.
Okay.
Yes, I would like to add my thoughts to this. So actually, I believe that public transport should remain the backbone of also the mobility of the future. And I do see a risk there that public transports could fade away in favor of other services that are maybe not that sustainable. I agree to what Marisa just said, but I wonder how feasible this actually is in terms of financeable for public transport. So if I am not a public transport provider, I can't answer this, but this would be my doubts.
Okay, so thank you. So I will continue the questions. So to the question from Terry. So it's a question for you, Marlene. So how is the technical discussion for standards or minimum requirements for data sharing integration? So formats, structures, data preparation handled in the Finnish Act on Transport Services?
Well, I would like to pass this question on to the experts from the GECKO project, because what I did was I restructured their work according to the SCMP principles, and this is a question that I cannot answer. I'm sorry.
Okay. So I don't know, Marisa, if you have thoughts on this.
Maybe Yannick could help me with it.
Well, in the Finnish Transport Act really was there to basically provide and to support the data sharing, and also to set these minimum requirements for sharing data, but also to basically provide a platform where data could be provided by new mobility operators, and that it would be accessible then for the operators and the authorities, and also for the ticketing information also, and pricing information was also then become more easily accessible, so that mass could be to facilitate mass in Finland. So by providing such a platform where data, transport data could be structured and accessible and standardized, this has helped to overcome a major barrier in the implementation of mobility as a service.
Yes. And I see, in addition to that, that regarding the idea behind this Finnish Act on Transport Services is that it's an adaptive model. So I think that in this framework, there will be regular discussions regarding the technical standards, so that the regulation can adapt to foster the mobility as a service. Okay, so next question. So thank you all of you. There are many questions there. From Juliana, so considering the policy recommendations that local governments could develop, so new mobility platforms to help networking between stakeholders, are there any initiatives to offer instruments to local governments, such as open source platforms to promote a shared platform format? This could increase predictability and also help overcome the barrier of local capacity to develop such instruments. So maybe it's joins a little bit the question that was mentioned earlier with the mass platform. So I don't know, what are your thoughts about?
Well, I think this is something that is still to be developed, this kind of guideline for such a platform. There are locally some initiatives taking place for this between authorities and service providers, where they could meet on a regular basis to then have a dialogue between the authority and all of the various new mobility solution providers. Scaling this up to a European level or a national level is something that I think we have not yet seen, or that I have not yet seen it, at least. But there are examples also from European initiatives. I think, for example, about the Smart Cities and Communities Initiative. So these type of initiatives which take place at European level, but also at local level, if various alternatives and adjustments to this could take place, then we can also establish this for new mobility.
Okay, thank you.
I would add that in some cases, for example, in Singapore, LTA developed this open platform with open data sources that it's not exactly networking among stakeholders, but it's an open data sources where that could enable co-creation of different solutions, and I think this is very important to have more brains thinking about a problem, and I think that this is also something that could pave the way to offer different solutions.
Yes, and do you think that the compliance map in some way can start to pave the way, in the sense that it offers like examples of good practices and good knowledge about what is existing, in order that public transport authorities can be inspired by this?
Yes. Also by seeing, by looking at other, let's say, best practices or good practices, depending on the score we elaborated in our assessment. Yes, this could be a good way to look at others to implement new solutions in their countries for policymakers.
Okay, so I would like to tell a few words, so please feel free to add comments, such as Pedro did in the chat. So I have a first comment and then a question. So starting by the comment, so the public sector subsidizes transport in many ways. The largest recipient has been by far the private car. Fuel and circulation taxes do not cover all the public expenses with infrastructure building and management, policing costs, etc., without even considering the cost of externalities. So this was a comment regarding the current subsidized instruments. And then, so I will continue with the questions. So operational subsidies to public transport are usually meant to compensate for the fact that PT prices are regulated to ensure affordability, not covering full operational costs. When defending public subsidies to new mobility services, are we also defending the same high level of regulation?
So in terms of pricing, I think we need to also think about what are the services for public goods, but also think about what is the business model of this service also. So for profit organizations, for profit companies which are providing a service for new mobility, in the end, they will have also investors, they will have also shareholders, and their aims could be on the one side to provide a public good, but on the other side, they will also have obligations to their shareholders. So I would not regulate it in the same way that a new mobility service provider would be in the same way as a public transport operator. They're both providing a service which should provide something for the public good, but their cost structures, their business models, and in the end, who that they will answer to will be different in these cases.
Okay, so Pedro said that it was a tricky questions, but yes, I agree with that. However, do you think that we can have a global transport offer integrating also these new mobility services and the public transport as it is currently? I mean, like a global offer. I mean, how do we see the mass in this case? I mean, in terms of public subsidies.
You're muted.
Yes. Sorry, Yannick, I think that we can't hear you. Unfortunately, we can't hear you. I don't know what you think about this, Melissa, Marlene. Maybe waiting for Yannick to solve his. We hear you.
And now?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. I was going to say, could you formulate the question again for me?
Yes. So as we are discussing about public subsidies regarding the global the public transport, as we are also mentioning the mass. So how do you see the public subsidies when we deal with an innovation like the mass, which integrates both public transport and private services?
Yeah, I think the operation model for MaaS also depends on who is providing the MaaS platform. So it could be provided by private parties, or it could also be driven by the public transport sector itself. And that will also be reflected in the services that are coming out of the MaaS platform. Private MaaS operators might be incentivized to facilitate or to push certain operators on their own platform, while coming from a public transport perspective, the MaaS platform, I think, will then be able to provide public transport as an integral service, as the backbone of the urban mobility system, and which would then also the other services complementing and feeding into the public transport network. So I think it very much also depends on who is providing the MaaS platform and the MaaS service.
Okay, thank you. So I have a nice question from Florian. So either GECKO 2 plan in the framework of Horizon Europe, building on the great and rich outcome of this project. So this is very nice question and comment.
We do not have a second GECKO project at the moment coming, but There are some interesting opportunities in Horizon Europe. So I think from our partnership, we very much found this work very interesting to do, and from also our audience and participants, if you're interested in continuing the collaboration, then feel free to contact us, and maybe, who knows, there could be a GECKO 2 in the future.
And then another question from Pedro. The money for public subsidies has to come from somewhere. Where would it come from to subsidize new mobility services? So there was already a comment from MDSnet.it. So in my opinion, from private car transport. Do you have also the same opinion on this, or what are your thoughts? And then I have a follow-up question from Pedro, so it comes very fast to the chat. So if that money would come from private car transport, have you explored regulatory solution that could squeeze it without raising political mayhem?
Well, we need, in terms of funding and subsidies, I think we need somehow a gradual reduction of private car use. And this could come from various regulatory levers, taxation, restrictions, restrictions in the urban mobility zones. And this could then be used to subsidize public transport. And depending on the network itself, where needed, it should be decided then on the local circumstances if other solutions maybe in the future would also need some support also. But that is something that I think has to be looked on the case by case basis. We have some examples of where we have seen this already, but it's not for every geography or national authority.
If I can add to this, this is a very radical approach, a kind of approach that we need, that would require to internalize external costs, which is actually something in German you would say ein dickes Brett. It's a very thick piece of wood that you have to work with. And this needs much more on various institutional and governance level as initiatives. As a single public transport operator or public authority, there could be trials to test this, but you would be quite alone with this. So radical approach and perspective, yes, but finding ways how to do this would be the task.
If I can, I totally agree on that. I mean, I think that the thing to start from is again to the data, and to so defining some indicators to in some way monetize the benefit that we could have, for example, from active travels, and so by stopping thinking in silos, we could in some way also take into account the benefit we could have in less healthcare expenses, and then to use that kind of money to prioritize more sustainable ways. And I think that it's not necessarily it shouldn't necessarily be a direct subsidy, but it also could be well, when a city recognizes the sustainability of a solution, could in some way being aware of the resources it has, assign, for example, parking spots to car sharing or electric vehicles or other, other kind of meaning of transportation.
Okay, thank you. I would like to thank you, all of you, for these interesting questions. Unfortunately, we arrive at the end of this very interesting conference. So for the last couple of questions, so there is the first one, which is from Juliana. So are there any bad practices example that could be explored to learn some lessons?
I think that the compliance map actually is a good tool to provide both good and bad practices. Looking at the score obtained by our assessment, I think that you can find many good, bad, best, and worst practices there. For all of the mobility solutions we studied in GECKO.
Yes. So I invite you to take a look at this. Compliance Mat on the website, or the link is into the chat. Last question. So do you think the publication of the new IPCC report on the climate crisis will make a difference and will encourage public policymakers to become more bold in their regulatory approaches? If yes, will that boldness convert it into more flexibility or into more rigid demands for sustainability?
Let's be positive. Yes. Short answer.
I think so. I hope so. Also, even if it will be hard, because we have it will be hard to proceed to drastic changes mentioned before about dropping car ownership. I mean, drastically. And then regarding the practical question, will the slides be available somewhere? So Yannick, I think that I don't know, we will be able to send the slides.
Yes, they will become available on the GECKO website. So we'll be posting some news there, and we'll also post this on our social media channels. So stay tuned and keep following our channels, and all the slides will become available.
And regarding the final comment, so I think that the discussions regarding climate changes are very interesting, especially within this summer when we saw many tragic events, climate events. So the final comment from Wolfgang is very encouraging us to pursue the project with GECKO too. I believe there is a need for a new integrated funding concept based on the polluter pays principle, which takes into account social and environmental aspects. I agree with that.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Hard to put in practice, but yes, on the principle, yes. So I think that is for the questions. So maybe Yannick, I will let you close the conference. So thank you very much, all of you, for these very nice and interesting questions and discussions.
Great, thank you very much, Caroline. So I'd like to thank all of our speakers for today and all of our participants. We have very much enjoyed working on this project, and we hope you will also find the resources we have available also useful for your work. So feel free to go to our project websites for more information and more resources there. I would also like to thank again our stakeholders, some of which are on this meeting now, for all your participation and your contributions in the project. And I would also like to give the final word to our stakeholders in the project about how they will be able to use the lessons learned from GECKO in their own work, and I hope it's the same also for our participants. So thank you very much. And we'll play this video now.
Concrete example, regulations for e-scooters, where we look what's going on in other cities for our own regulation, and of course the exchange also with the operators is something where we took some lessons directly from GECKO.
I've been able to take the learnings from the GECKO project and apply them directly to my role on advisory councils to some of these new mobility companies. What I learned has directly informs the contributions I make to those discussions.
I'm currently managing some automated tyre checking equipment, and at the moment we can use that as a targeting tool for enforcement officers. But looking to the future and trying to apply some of the skills that I've now got, could we look at the legislation being changed so that that equipment could actually issue a prohibition notice to a defective vehicle rather than an examiner doing it?
We don't discuss regulations or guidance when it comes to new mobility services and how they work together with public transport. So one of the things that I've done is to try to ensure that there are discussions about regulatory frameworks, and I've provided some examples directly from the GECKO project to give these agencies an idea of the kinds of things they should be considering.
The GECKO project gave us the chance to share our vision. We believe that it's very important that local operators are heard and that new regulations are not only made for huge international platforms. You cannot underestimate the role of local operators in building ecosystems for resilient cities. So thanks a lot, GECKO people. Thanks a lot.